Juneau World Affairs Council presents Finding a Future in the Middle East with Paul Barker. Barker has spent decades working for international aid organizations, most recently as the country director of Afghanistan for Save the Children International. Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, Palestine, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are on the long list of countries where Barker has worked.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate the turnout, and I'm surprised and excited to find out what a wide audience we're going to have later on. I want to talk mainly today about Iran. We can talk also about some of my other concerns with Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East, if time permits. But I think Iran is particularly timely given the status of our negotiations and diplomacy efforts over their nuclear program. So we'll focus there. Other way, I guess. Okay. I have a long history with Iran. It goes back to 1968 when Bill Cummings and I were part of a Lewis and Clark College overseas study program to Iran. This is our picture of our group, and if you look closely, Bill Cummings is there. He doesn't think he has any pictures with him in it from Iran, but he's there. After graduating from Lewis and Clark, the next day, as it turned out, I went to Iran in the Peace Corps. My 2-year service there went on to 5 years as I just kept getting more and more fascinated with the country. These pictures are from Bidokht in Khorasan, where I spent my first 2 years. Me on the left with no beard and slightly younger ambiance. One of my favorite students and his grandfather. You can see how diet has changed, nutrition's improved. Stunting isn't as big a problem. His grandfather, when he was a young man, rode a donkey to Karbala and back as part of their pilgrimage obligations as Shiite Muslims. And the shrine on the right is for the Nematollah Sufi order, which is centered in my village. My second 2 years were in a tribal high school in Shiraz, a boarding high school for students from the different tribes in the area. This woman was not a student, she was the mother of one of our students. And I put her up because she grew up in a nomadic community, traveled up and down with the goats and sheep and camels in the nomadic tradition until the household economy suffered under a drought, and she became a carpet weaver, supported her family for years of carpet weaving. All of her children managed to graduate from high school and either teacher training college or university. Her grandchildren, including the children of my students, went on to get PhDs and other graduate studies. So the point is what tremendous change Iran has seen over the decades and how much more advanced the country is now. But this is carpet weaving when I was in the Peace Corps. Iran is an ancient country. These are the current borders for the last 150 years or so. It's got a lot of mountains in the north and the west, and that's where most of the population is. The oil wealth is in what's colored green there, which is deceptive because it's not at all a green area. It's very much a desert, but it's low elevation. It's a country primarily made up of Persian speakers. So this is an ethnicity map of Iran. The Persian speakers are the sort of beige-colored area in the middle. A large minority is Turkish-speaking, so that's the purple area in the northwest, and then the Qashqai area is kind of pinkish down in the south center. Baluch in the southeast, and Kurds and other ethnic groups scattered around. Iran, this is a picture of Iran and American military bases in the region. And if an Iranian would look at this, and as you look at this, you might question who's threatening who today. We'll come back to that in more detail as we move along. Historically, Iran goes back at least 2,500 years to Achaemenid dynasty, and there are many dynasties come since. This is the extent of that dynasty. It went from the Indus River in Pakistan, India, over past the Nile, up touching Greece, up into Central Asia. It was the largest empire the world had seen at that point in history. And Iranians are very aware of their history, more so than most people in the world. And a lot of countries in the Middle East like Iraq and Syria and Jordan, are creations of the diplomatic process at the end of World War I. Iran, no. Those are borders it's had for 150 years. It's a political consciousness they've had going back 2,500 years. So it's different than some of the countries we've been dealing with. This is just a brief look at dynasties. We won't go through them, but to emphasize that they do have this historical sense of who they are and where they've come from. And the first dynasty was the Medes and the Persians, the Achaemenid dynasty, and there is a Mede and a Persian. Exchanging a few comments. These are from bas-reliefs in Persepolis. These are different peoples from around the empire bringing their gifts to the king of kings in Persepolis at the Nowruz, the spring holiday, way back when. These visitors came from as far as Africa, so either Somalia or Ethiopia in this case, and there's some sort of antelope sort of creature being delivered as a gift. And this is Bactrian camel coming from Afghanistan and Central Asia. These are inscriptions of the Achaemenid Empire, documenting the extent of their empire, written in 3 languages, translated in the 19th century. And this is probably the oldest, what do you call these? The stones you bury under a foundation in a building. And it's time capsule is what I was looking for. Time capsule. It goes back to the time of Cyrus when he conquered Babylon. He had this inscription made and buried under the gate of a palace. So it wasn't discovered until the 19th century. It documents his victories and also his policies. So this is considered the first charter of human rights in human history. And it gave rights to minority groups, recognized minority religions, gave minorities the right to go back where they came from, including the Jews who were then freed from Babylon to go back to historic Palestine. The ancient religion of Iran was Zoroastrianism, religion of powers of light and the forces of darkness fighting with each other. Fire is their key symbol, the power of light, and so their fire temples have these fires that have been going on for centuries, hopefully thousands of years, because the religion goes back at least 2,700 years. It's a religion whose ideas have been very formative in Iran all those years. It also had a significant influence on Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and other religions in the Middle East. So the idea of angels and devils and heaven and hell came from Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrian Tower of Silence, where they used to bury their dead, expose their dead actually to the elements. And this is the tomb of Esther and Mordecai, who you probably remember from the Old Testament. It's in Hamadan, which was a center of Jewish civilization in Iran going back to pre-Babylonian times. And we visited there in April last year. My wife and I were in a group of Peace Corps volunteers who returned to Iran. We visited with the rabbi at the shrine and talked about the status of Jews in Iran. And in general, he feels that as long as they're not outspoken Zionistic supporters of Israel, their status is fine. Jews have one member of parliament in Iran, even today, as part of the constitution of Iran. They have had programs about their culture and their religion aired on Iranian television. It's perhaps not as persecuted as one's led to believe by a lot of the press. What one does hear is statements by Ahmadinejad, the former president, which have not been well translated. So let me read this one for you, and I think there's one word that will stick out. It says, Imam Goft, in rejim estalgar Quds, bayad asafe ruzegar maf shavad. The word you probably understood was regime. He didn't say Israel. He's talking about the regime which is occupying Jerusalem. He's saying that that regime will pass from the page of time. And so this has been interpreted as wiping Israel off the map of the earth, which isn't exactly what he said. And Iranians would explain this as saying, in the same way that the apartheid regime in South Africa was illegitimate, the same way the Soviet regime in former Soviet Union was illegitimate, these regimes will pass from the page of time, not necessarily through violence or war, but they will pass. It's sort of God will. It goes back to actually a Zoroastrian concept of far. There's a Persian word for it, which means good governance, and that a government has legitimacy because of the way it treats its people and the justice that it imbues. And the dynasties in Iran over the centuries fall when they lose this concept of far. Iran's a center of great learning for many centuries. This is the tomb of Ibn Sina, or known in the West as Avicenna. He was a great mathematician, doctor, philosopher, poet in the Middle Ages. He had a lot to do with the translation and preservation of knowledge from Greek learning into modern times. We visited his tomb. It's important, I think, as a symbol of the kind of people who are revered in Iran. People of learning and great poets have monuments to them in Iran. You don't see monuments to soldiers, and anymore you don't see monuments to shahs. This is the first page of the Masnavi by Jalaluddin Rumi, fantastic book of Persian poetry, great Sufi poet from the 13th century. And it's a symbol of Iranian learning. It's a beautiful poetry. It's 25,000 rhymed verses, so it's larger than the Iliad by, I think, 4 times. Huge masterwork and beautifully written. It's sometimes called the Persian Quran. It starts by saying Beshnu az nature and hikayat mikonad, which sounds a bit similar to the way the Quran starts with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. But it's in a way more profound. It's trying to get at the essence of a religion, that one should listen to one's heart, one should listen to that voice which is speaking through the reed flute or whatever to get to understanding deeper meanings. So Persian Sufi poetry has played a dominant role in the consciousness of Iran over those years. Shia religion is this great branch of Islam. Goes back to this historic divide in the early years of Islam over who should be the rightful successor of the Prophet. Shia believing it being Ali, and through Ali his sons Hassan and Hussein, and so on. The Shiite religion was imposed as a state religion in Iran relatively recently, well, 1500, so in Iranian terms, relatively recently, by the Safavid dynasty. This is the Polikhaju in Isfahan, where they established their capital. Beautiful bridge, both from outside and underneath. Masterpieces of Persian architecture dominate the city till today. A curious observation, though, just outside of this bridge is this sign, which says, Shanat Mamnuast, swimming is forbidden, which is curious because the river is dry, and it has been dry for the last 5 years, owing to a dam that was built upstream to provide water to Yazd and other desert areas. So bringing environmental issues that Iran has to deal with. So sort of combining a few thoughts there. But back to the Safavids, masterpieces of Persian architecture, intricately designed mosques and palaces. This is the dome in the, used to be the Shah's Mosque, now it's called the Imam's Mosque because everything that used to be Shah is now Imam. And this is a close-up, because cameras can do this nowadays, of the detail in that tile work. It's just amazingly intricate and so high up. This is from the Golestan Palace. And it's a palace built in Tehran by the Qajar dynasty, the next to the last dynasty of Shahs. And they are people despised by most Iranians in history. They lost this concept of far, of being a just government. They sold provinces, basically gave them away to the Russians in the north. They sold concessions to the British and to the Russians for large parts of the economy. Also, they could support their lavish lifestyle and their harems and their trips to Europe. But this is sort of the opulence of the Golestan Palace, and it's beauty is about that deep. It's built on bricks and it's not very substantial behind. So the dynasty was sensed to have lost this concept of phare in about 1905 when there was a constitutional revolution. And democracy took hold as a real force in Iran from 1905 on. The constitution was issued as sort of the Magna Carta of Iran. It has much deeper democratic roots than most countries in the Middle East. This is a carpet that we saw in the National Carpet Museum in Tehran. It's a very interesting carpet. It's not the sort of detail you're used to seeing, but if you look closely, there's some faces there that you might recognize. There's George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. There's a canoe, there's teepees, all these things. It's a celebration of American culture as understood in those times. The point being that the early experience of America in Iran was actually pretty positive. And we were a country which much admired in the old days. So just a few points on Iranian American history. 19th, early 20th century, the missionaries were probably what existed for American aid programs in Iran. The biggest amongst these aid organizations was the Presbyterian Church, who established hospitals and schools and technical schools and the first girls' school. Later on, the Iranian government hired Morgan Schuster, an American banker, to become the Treasurer General of Iran, to rid Iran of these horrible concessions that had been given to the Russians and the British, and to establish more of a modern financial system. In World War II, Iran was occupied by the British and the Russians to establish a highway for getting their military supplies to Russia. The Americans joined that occupation, but we weren't actually leading it. But one name that comes out of that occupation is Norman Schwarzkopf. This is actually the father of the Norman Schwarzkopf we know from the Gulf War, but he helped establish the Iranian gendarmerie during World War II. But then we come to 1951, and this is a watershed event for Iran and for actually much of the world. This is Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran, and he's standing next to the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia on his trip to Iran after addressing the General Assembly. And he was at the General Assembly of the UN to explain why Iran had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and why it was Iran's right to protect its oil resources. I think Alaska feels the same way about its oil resources. And the British, of course, didn't feel the same way. And so it led to a long, intense confrontation between Iran and the British. And the British were able to pressure their friends and allies into to not standing in their way on this argument. Mossadegh was a lawyer, educated in Switzerland. He's sort of eccentric. He was given to fits of laughter and fits of crying. He was a brilliant orator, but he was also very stubborn in his ideas and wasn't going to compromise much with the British. So he did nationalize the oil company. British lashed embargoes on Iran's oil and banking systems, much like America has done in recent years. The Americans initially didn't support this. Truman and the British wanted to have military action to go sort out Iran, to teach them a lesson or two. President Truman thought that actually America's interests are better served in supporting nationalist ideals of evolving countries in the third world, of being seen on the side of freedom. And he tried to mediate between the British and Iranians. That didn't work, but it didn't fail either. But then we had elections. Eisenhower won in America. Churchill came to power again in Britain. Eisenhower had the Dulles brothers in charge of the CIA and State Department. And all the British had to do was warn about the communist threat in Iran. And that was enough to have the Eisenhower administration committed that we had to be involved in implementing this British coup to get rid of the Shah. The British embassy had been closed by this time, and there were spies, and staff sent into exile. So it was left to the Americans to organize this coup. And history has changed since then. This coup, the second attempt, was successful, and the Americans brought back the Shah, who had gone into exile. So if this comes up in the news nowadays, American commentators say, oh, that was a long time ago. In Iran, 2,500 years ago was a long time ago. 50 years ago was not. So this is fairly current memory in Iran. It was a watershed. It led to similar coups in Central America. The Americans were excited. We had this low-budget way of changing regimes and imposing our will on countries. It led to a perception that America is more concerned with its commercial interests than with the rights of people that in the countries that might feel these resources belong to them. It gave rise to anti-American sentiments in other countries. And it contributed to a lot of the anti-American fervor which evolved into the 1979 revolution. And the taking of the American embassy by the students was probably out of fear that once again the Americans would bring back the Shah. So fear that this history is going to repeat itself. In the 60s, there was about $1 billion of American development assistance to Iran, back when $1 billion was a lot of money. 1973, OPEC had to embark their thing, and they raised oil prices around the world. So Iran's oil revenues went up from $4 billion in 1973 to $19 billion in 1975. Vastly richer country, seen as able to support its own development and own security. Nixon didn't forget about what this meant, and he thought it'd be great to have Iran as our proxy in the Middle East. So selling military weapons to Iran to become America's proxy for military service in the Middle East was a good idea to him. And U.S. sold about $10 billion worth of weapons to Iran over those years. We have the revolution, we have Khomeini coming to power, we have the hostage taking, and we have finally the release of the hostages in 1981. But I think this memory of 1979 is frozen Iran in our memory and in their memory is something that's been very difficult to get beyond for a long time. And it's been very difficult to find opportunities to overcome that history. It led the U.S. to probably tilt towards Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. Our anxieties over Iran and mistrust probably led to a U.S. naval ship shooting down Iranian Air Flight 655 over the Gulf, killing, I think it was 290 civilians, something we haven't apologized for. Iran, I mentioned there have been rare opportunities for changing perceptions. One, I think, came when Khatami was elected president, and he was looking for ways to improve relations with the West, and this particularly became an opportunity in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. The Iranian government not only expressed their condolences and sympathy for American suffering in 2001, they collaborated with American intelligence people in planning activities in Afghanistan. They worked as a major contributor to redevelopment in Afghanistan, spending $600 million on development projects mainly in Western Afghanistan. All of this came to an end in 2002 when President Bush announced in his State of the Union address that Iran was part of an axis of evil. So I think that historic opportunity was lost. So Muslim students, this Basij group who took over the embassy, there are other groups as well, but they became seen as enforcers of the edicts of the Imam. Over decades, they've become a very wealthy institution in Iran. Perhaps the third wealthiest institution in Iran is this radical student group. They were involved in violently putting down the Green Revolution in 2009. Other elements of the Revolutionary Guard have been involved with nefarious military and other assistance to Syria, to Iraq, to Yemen, rebels. And this faction within the Iranian government would probably be opposed to normalization of relations with the West. So this is the American embassy as it looks today. We visited there in April last year, and it's got these signs outside with anti-American rhetoric on them. It has the rotor of the helicopter, which was part of the failed rescue attempt in there. The embassy is now a museum of anti-American sentiment from this Basij group, these Iranian students. We didn't see many people coming in and out of the museum, but it's still there. Back to my Peace Corps years. The gentleman on the right is Hossein Abdullahzadeh. He was actually my very best student. And that's his father on the left. I learned after the hostages were released, a couple of them were friends of mine, that one of the captors, one of the students involved had been one of my former students. And it wasn't until 1999 I learned out it was my very best student. So I was brought it home. But he's actually a good kid. You know, now he's put all this revolutionary stuff behind him. He's involved in IT work in Tehran. And a lot of things get caught up in the excitement of the moment in revolutions. Iran does have this nefarious side. We talked about the Basij, the Revolutionary Guard. It also has a horrible human rights record with the highest execution rate per capita in the world. U.S. has the highest incarceration rate. Iran has the highest execution rate, primarily for drug trafficking. They also have a bad record when it comes to treating with the press, and we have an American journalist in jail there now for about 9 months, a journalist we met when we were in Tehran last year. Iran is involved in different provocations around the region, but it's also useful to remember that since 1755, it has not invaded another country. It does odd things, it's things that we wouldn't approve of or don't accept, but it's not militarily adventurous that way. It has a conservative posture. Some of the groups it support are Shiite. One, Hezbollah, is Sunni. They have a lot of anti-Zionist rhetoric, which is offensive. So it's a complicated government. And this is Big Bird. Well, it's an Iranian Big Bird, which is part of a garden outside of Shiraz that we saw this past year when we were there. Iranians have a way of wanting to decorate places, and so sides of highways are well manicured. Modern Iran has got a lot of accomplishments. We talked about some of the ugly sides, but on the positive side, very high levels of university graduation. 60% of the graduates are women. Women are highly involved in the workforce. They drive cars. They can have different jobs in government and parliament and be ministers. They have an advanced public health system, one of the best in the world. They have had a very successful family planning program. Vibrant cinema industry, partially spawned by censorship and sort of redirecting some of those creative energies, but it's very impressive. The road network in Iran has been totally revised in the last 4 decades. The cities are connected by 4-lane freeways. Most of the economy is fairly modern. And if you look at the UNDP's statistics on Human Development Index, Iran actually fares very well, much better than Bangladesh, Pakistan, or other South Asian countries. Actually, its numbers compare very well with higher developed countries in the world. So the Brazils, the Argentinas, countries that are actually fairly prosperous. Back to our group with Lewis and Clark College. We're all standing there with some Iranian guides in front of a pool of water. That pool of water is part of a research reactor. It was all finished and working in 1968 when we were there. It was a piece of pride the Iranians wanted to show us. It was part of an American aid program to Iran sponsored by the Eisenhower administration. So if we want to blame people for starting Iran on a nuclear adventure, we can start looking at our own history in Iran. This actually is very close to the university dormitory where Bill and I stayed. It was out in the desert then. It's now very much in the city. You're welcome, Bill. So I won't go into intrinsic detail on the Iranian nuclear program, but a few points. One is it does go back a long ways. It was started with our help. There have been accusations of Iranians wanting to develop a nuclear bomb going back at least till 1992. Netanyahu was saying they're going to have a bomb in a couple of years in 1992. American Congress thought it would be 1 year, and they had enough weapons and material grade uranium for bombs at that time. So these fears, these accusations go back a long ways. There have been efforts by Israel and the United States to sabotage their program. And most dramatically, there have been breakthroughs on the diplomatic front. For decades, it was illegal for American politicians, embassy folks, State Department employees to have contact with Iranians. Under the Obama administration, that's changed. We now have very high-level contacts with the Iranians. I understand that Secretary of State Kerry has spent more time with the Iranian prime minister than with foreign minister than any other one in the world. So I think it's a very sincere effort to try and chart a new course with Iran under the Obama administration. More details on the ups and downs of the negotiations, the sanctions, the pressure. The framework agreement, which was announced this year. And then we have our congressmen and senators wanting to second guess this policy. So, does Iran have a nuclear weapons program? We don't know, actually. Maybe. They have a nuclear weapons capacity. It goes back to the 1950s. They have nuclear engineers being educated even today in American universities. The University of Oregon, I was told, has over 100 students, Iranian students, Oregon State in Corvallis, in their engineering and other programs, including nuclear science. They have secretive elements of their program that they've tried to hide from inspectors. They're surrounded by enemies. They have reasons they might want to have some sort of big weapon. And they've seen the deterrence value of nuclear weapons. Countries that have them don't seem to be so threatened anymore. But maybe not. Maybe not because the Ayatollahs, the effective leaders of Iran, have declared that weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, are un-Islamic. Iran doesn't have this history of starting wars with other people, and dropping a nuclear weapon on somebody would be suicidal in that sense. Modern Iran has not occupied any country. Rigorous monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Authority hasn't found any proof of weaponization of their program. And Iran has honored most of the terms of agreements it's signed over the years, and has been subject to the most rigorous monitoring of any country in the world when it comes to a nuclear program. So I think there may or there may not be a nuclear program. I think the framework agreement that was recently agreed to, there seem to be different interpretations of it, but the broad brush lines are fairly clear. It's not just the United States and Iran, it's P5 plus 1. So it's the Security Council members plus Germany negotiating this deal with Iran. It's got some very impressive components. Reduces their centrifuges by 2/3. It forces Iran to give up 97% of their nuclear stockpile. In return, US and EU nuclear sanctions will be suspended. And once again, the IAEA has confirmed that Iran has taken these steps. So the sanctions would end. Some American voices are highly opposed to this possible turn of events. One of the most outspoken is John Bolton, who thinks that it's irrelevant that countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, and Libya, who we didn't mention, have decided to discontinue their nuclear weapons programs, or nuclear programs. Iran, he thinks, is different. He thinks that successive administrations have failed to stop them. The Shia bomb would be very dangerous. Force Saudi Arabia to get one from Pakistan and Egypt, and everybody else would want them. The only solution is to bomb Iran, according to John Bolton, the same way that Israel did in 1981 to Iraq and to Syria in 2007. Well, that's one view. Netanyahu and 47 senators seem to take a similar view, thinking that more sanctions would force Iran to make even a better deal. I think that's doubtful. If this current round fails, America will be seen as responsible for that failure, for having unrealistic negotiating position. So ultimately, the choice is going to be a negotiated arrangement, or living with an Iranian weapons program, or militarily attacking Iran. I don't think there's another logical alternative there. Ambassador Thomas Graham has decades of experience negotiating nuclear weapons programs. He's also concerned that Iran not develop a nuclear weapon. It would break the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It would encourage other countries to grow these weapons. But unreasonable demands won't get us there. Without a framework agreement, the result, the result if the U.S. is to block the agreement. If we don't have a framework agreement, we won't be able to negotiate or end this program. An attack on Iran would delay their program by a couple of years at most. They already have what's most valuable, which is the knowledge of how to build weapons. So Iran is not Iraq. Iran's population is 80 million. That's greater than the combined populations of Iraq and Afghanistan. Iran is very technologically sophisticated and highly developed country. Its regime is also very unpopular. It's probably one of the most unpopular regimes in the Middle East. It's also, ironically, one of the countries where Americans are probably more popular than any other country in the Middle East. And as you travel around Iran as an American, as we did last year, people are just so happy to see you, so welcoming, and surprisingly open about telling you how bitter they are about this government they've been stuck with for the last 4 decades. Iran is a surprising place. It's also probably one of the most secular countries in the Middle East, and that's an impression that probably most Americans don't have. But I think it's true. Our last day there last year was a Friday, the Muslim Day of Prayer. It's the day when these giant crowds of people sometimes show up for prayers outside Tehran University, and the mullahs and the ayatollahs will harangue about how horrible America is and how horrible Israel is. Well, we walked past that street, which was empty when we walked past it. It was a little bit before prayer time. Went up to this park 2 blocks north of the university, of the street where the prayers are. And we had a little picnic in the park together with lots of Iranians and families, and here, like university students, men and women together. And it's not how we imagine Iranians spending a Friday afternoon. But most Iranians could care less about this regime, from all I could tell. They want to get on with a normal life for themselves and their families. They're hospitable and gracious. They're happy and excited to see us. This is one of our former Peace Corps volunteers meeting some students outside the Iran-Bastan Museum in Tehran. They were so excited to see us and to ask us how how it was and have us there. This is another group of students in Shiraz who were equally excited to see us. They were on a school field trip, and they had to have their picture taken with the Americans when they found out we were there. I think we're at a unique time to mend relations with Iran. It only happens every couple of decades, and I think we're at one of those. Iran has some very sophisticated leaders now. One is Mohammad Jawad Zarif, who's the foreign minister. He's educated in American universities up through a PhD level. He was Iran's ambassador to the UN, so he understands politics internationally in a very sophisticated way. He helped negotiate the end of a hostage deal in Lebanon because of Iran's relations with Hamas. And he has a long record of trying to improve relations with the US. President Rouhani came to power because, somewhat like President Khatami before him, he came across as the most open-minded of the clerics running for president. And he seems to really be looking for opportunities to make a new beginning. And Khatami before him, he did his best, but he wasn't willing to take difficult decisions against the regime. But there's a structural problem, probably on both sides of the water. In Iran, the most powerful leaders are not accessible, but the most accessible leaders are not powerful. So we have these great people in key positions, the presidency and the foreign minister, who would like to make a breakthrough, but the powerful people are the ayatollahs, who so far are cautiously giving approval for these negotiations to go ahead, and they're keeping the Basij and these real radical people under control, but they're yet to make a real strong public commitment in favor of this deal. In the US, we have divided government as well. Republicans in Congress, president in charge of the White House and the executive branch, threats of sanctions. We have the influence of the Israeli lobby in our decision making. So it's difficult for either party to move ahead quickly to resolve this issue. But really, I think it's the best chance we've had in decades, and I hope we don't lose it. I think we have to be careful that we don't punish people who are willing to make sacrifices and take risks for peace. And I think that's the risk we make if we try to put unnecessary and unuseful pressure on Iran. Denis McDonough is the White House Chief of Staff and argues strongly that new sanctions would be counterproductive. They would embolden hardliners, as I'm sure they would. It would mean that the U.S. Would be separated from our allies. Allies would no longer see a reason to support the sanctions. That regime would fall apart. I think he's right. We have a lot of common interests with Iran. Iran would like to have stability on both of its borders. The U.S. has a strong presence in Afghanistan and Iraq. Iran would like to end the opium trade coming from Afghanistan to Iran. I think Americans would be happy with that. They have a huge problem with narcotics addiction in Iran. Iran would like a stable Iraq. They also feel ISIS is a great enemy. So I think we have reasons to want to try to work together on that. They would both like predictable energy supplies and prices. And Iran even talks about wanting to end fossil fuel addiction. That's one of the excuses they give for wanting to develop a nuclear power program in Iran. I wish they would go to alternative energy, to green energy. There's a lot of sun in Iran. But anyway, a lot of national pride at this point is tied up in the nuclear program. And I'll end with this quote from Saadi. He's a famous poet, now buried in Shiraz, one of the Sufi poets. He says, Beni Adam azay yek digarand, chun da afarinish zayek goharand, that the children of Adam are members of each other because in the creation they came from the same jewel. We're all part of the same family. And every Iranian student can tell you that. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions. And we have about 10 minutes for questions, and There's
Thanks so much for a really, really good talk. And my wife and I have been interested in Iran for a long time. We had the good fortune of studying with someone you may know, William K. Archer, so many years ago, who was an Iran expert. I have really the feeling that in the United States we're fed a particular line on Iran, and I think you pointed out quite a bit of that. If you could comment a little bit on how Iran is viewed in other Western democracies, or for that matter, in other developed countries, because that might sort of set, if you know something about that, that might give me a little bit better perspective on how much of a line I'm getting from peculiar American policies in the Israeli lobby. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think there are two countries in the world that seem to share this great aversion to Iran and fear of it. That's the United States and Israel. I think it's important to recognize opinion even in these two countries is divided. So in Israel, for instance, I in November in Washington met a representative of their nuclear program who is adamantly supporting the diplomatic effort. He's part of Global Zero, an effort for global nuclear disarmament. And he thinks it would be a total disaster to allow this diplomatic opportunity to fail. The head of Mossad in Israel is another person who's been outspoken in favor of diplomacy, feeling that the Netanyahu government has greatly overstated the threats from Iran. I think most European capitals would be of a similar view. It's interesting to travel in Iran now as an American because only 3 countries in the world have to have these minders or guides with them theoretically at all times: Americans, British, and Canadians. Americans and British because of our nefarious Secret Service activities in their countries, and Canadians, I guess, because they hid the American diplomats for some time after the taking of the hostages. But Europeans can travel to Iran and just be like normal tourists, and you see them walking through the bazaars and getting on buses and whatever. I haven't spent that much time in Europe, but from talking with European friends in the aid business, where I have spent a lot of time, I think most of them would argue that America has been unfairly paranoid when it comes to Iran and unwilling to look critically at our own role in the situation as it has evolved. And I think that's actually a very difficult thing to do. My father used to say, "Would that some giver give us the gift to see ourselves as others see us." You know, that it's not easy to see ourselves in the light that Iranians might see us, to look at 1953 and say, well, that's not so long ago, and that actually is very relevant to where we are today. Yeah.
Thank you for being with us. I was in Tehran on the 13th day of the new year in 1969. It was a holiday, and everybody was out doing their thing in the spring park. It was a lovely day. I was only there for a couple of days. Where are we in the scenario of following up on these lengthy negotiations that have happened? What are the options, the scenario options for what's going to happen next?
Well, there is the talks are supposed to come back together and try to bring life to this framework agreement to figure out the details of how the monitoring will happen. And I haven't spent so much time in the technical details, but I'm sure there's lots of complications to work out. The big challenge after that, assuming that our negotiators and their negotiators agree, is going to be to get our Congress to say this is okay. They've insisted on having a role here. And to get the Iranian government, particularly the Ayatollahs, to say it's okay. I'm cautiously optimistic on both of those fronts. Of the two, I'm probably more anxious about partisanship in the American Congress, and that people who seem to want to oppose Obama on everything will insist on opposing him on this, even if it's a very good deal for America.
Thanks again for a very good talk. Could you hypothesize on what it's going to look like in terms of regional stability, assuming we can get an agreement? How do you think the Saudis will react to it? How do you think the Gulf states will react to it? What will the countries surrounding Iran, particularly the Sunni countries, do if they see the United States as pulling back from the role it's had?
Yeah, I think that's the delicate issue, and perhaps the good news is that our government's very sensitive to that, and I think you'll see that in the messages that they've been sending out to the Saudis and the other countries about complicated issues like Yemen and so on. They will feel threatened and they'll feel vulnerable. They remember the days when Iran was a close ally of America and they were not. And seeing that tide change will feel somewhat threatening to them. They talk about the danger of them wanting to get nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia probably provided most of the financing for Pakistan to have its bomb. So there's a feeling that perhaps Saudi Arabia could buy a bomb from Pakistan, much easier than developing your own. I don't know if that would happen or not, but it's part of a very troubling scenario if Iran is able to develop a weapon. If the regime, this talks are successful and Iran is not able to get a weapon, I think they will be very concerned that the monitoring program is rigorous enough that not only the IAEA in the United States and these other Security Council members are satisfied, but they also can have a level of confidence that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. I think it's something that can be managed, but we have to be very sensitive to it as we move forward. I think a lot can happen if countries can work together, which have had difficulty in the past. I think one encouraging sign was recently when Iran was invited to come to Pakistan for, I think it was a foreign minister's discussion, to talk about the Yemen crisis and why they needed, what a diplomatic way would be of solving that. So the willingness of the Sunni countries to invite the Shia Iran to that discussion I thought was very positive. I think the fact that Iran has some very skilled diplomats now in their foreign ministry is encouraging, and they will also be sensitive to these concerns. I hope I'm right.
One other quick question. Assume that the United States doesn't cause the talks to fail, but the Ayatollahs do. Would you kind of give us your views of what would happen with the younger generation in Iran?
Yeah, hard to know. We've seen them rise up, especially in 2009, but other times as well, to voice their concern for a more democratic, more open, more free future, getting back to some of those ideals that Mossadegh was fighting for in the 1950s. But I think the fact of being so violently put down in 2009 also weighs on them, and they'll probably be reluctant to rise up that way again. I don't know, but I know that they are very disenchanted with this regime. They don't go to the mosque much. They don't accept a lot of the edicts and a lot of restrictions from the regime. You know, what Khomeini says about Israel, I think, is also very true of the Iranian regime. This regime, which is occupying Tehran, will pass from the page of time sometime. We've got 2 more minutes if there are any more questions. If we've run out of questions, then I thank everyone for coming. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to people who are seriously interested and informed. One more question?
From what you have heard and read, etc., did Iran really go into Yemen? And are they really supporting one faction in Yemen?
You know, I don't know. I think there are a lot of reasons to think they're sympathetic to this Houthi faction, which has taken the capital. I wouldn't be surprised if they are providing technical military assistance as military advisors, as they've done in Iraq and in Syria. I don't think they probably need to provide weapons because they probably confiscated so many weapons from the former regime. But they probably have some diplomatic sway in Yemen. And so there may be some kernels there that could be brought together with the Saudis if the Saudis can really disengage from their military incursion into Yemen to find a way forward. We can hope. Yeah.
Let's assume for a moment that the negotiations succeed. And
Yes.
let's assume for a minute that. What do you think it would take to move both of our countries towards a genuine reconciliation? Because it seems to me that on both sides there's a lot of very bitter, painful memories that would have to be worked through to come to some, not just a rapprochement, but a real reconciliation.
Yeah. So what would it take for two countries to come together, assuming the negotiations are successful? It would take time. I think Iranian people are eager for this change, and to the extent that American tourists can go to Iran, and I encourage anybody who can to go to Iran. It's a beautiful, welcoming country with great food and incredible rich history. And it's bargain basement prices, so you can have a very good tour there for little money. But it will take time, it'll take effort and goodwill, but it can be done. We're out of time.
That was Paul Barker in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded on May 4th, 2015 at 360 in Juneau, with support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman & Associates Incorporated, Core Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.